There is an old saying in the trades that the ones who know the least about a thing are always the loudest in their certainty that it cannot be done. The ones who know the most tend to be quiet, tend to keep their hands moving, and tend to let the work speak for them across the slow, patient passage of years. Ruth Hadley knew this as instinctively as she knew the weight of a good steel hook in the palm of her hand, the particular give of old iron when a rust bloom has gone deep versus when it sits shallow and can be coaxed back with patience and the right abrasive. She did not learn it from a book. She learned it the way most lasting knowledge enters a person, through the body, through repetition, through seasons of doing a thing alone while the world told her clearly and kindly that she was wasting her time. The shed sat at the back of her property on Cutter's Road, a 2-acre parcel in a county where farmsteads had been subdivided and sold in pieces for 3 generations, so that what had once been a working quarter section was now a narrow strip of rocky ground with a house too small and a shed too large and a woman too stubborn, by most local assessments, to understand the difference between collecting and hoarding. The shed was 32 feet by 20, poured concrete floor cracked at the northwest corner, metal roof that sang in the rain. It had been her father's, then her father's older brother's before that. And before that, it had been a working implement barn for a harvest operation that employed 32 seasonal hands and cut 2,000 acres of small grain every August. All of that was gone. What was left was the shed, and inside the shed, on 3 sets of rough-welded iron shelves her uncle had built from salvaged bed frames, was the beginning of something Ruth had been accumulating for 22 years without telling anyone what it was for. She paid a dime for every rusted hay hook they threw out. That was the fact that people remembered later, the fact that became the shorthand for the whole story. But like most shorthand, it was only partly accurate and missed the texture of the thing entirely. It was not only hay hooks, it was hay hooks and binding hooks and threshing hooks and the particular short-shank double-point hooks used in the old stationary bale presses, which were different from the long-shank hooks used in the traveling balers, which were themselves different from the decorative but still functional hooks pressed and stamped in the 1920s by 3 different Iowa manufacturers whose names are now known only to people who have spent time in sheds like Ruth's. It was forks, hay forks, manure forks, silage forks, the 3-tine and the 4-tine and the widespread 5-tine. The ones with the ash handles still sound, and the ones with the handles rotted to splinters, still useful for their heads. It was hand tools in the broader sense, the sickles and scythes and grain cradles and stubble rakes, and it was the small mechanical implements, the hand-cranked seeders and the cast-iron cultivator wheels and the wooden-handled dibbles, and it was the hardware that held all of it together, the bolts and clevis pins and clevises themselves, the thumb latches and barn hinges in the particular scrollwork pattern that 3 or 4 regional blacksmith shops had been producing in the 1880s until they were priced out by catalog suppliers in the 1890s. She paid a dime for each when she could get them for a dime. She paid a quarter when she could not. She paid $2.50 at a farm auction in the autumn of her 43rd year for a grain cradle so well proportioned and so perfectly balanced in the hand that even she, who did not traffic in sentiment, felt her throat close a little when she lifted it. It had 5 fingers. The wood of the fingers was black walnut, aged to a deep, warm brown. The snath was ash, worn smooth at the hand positions, which told you everything about how long it had been used and how correctly. Because a snath only wears smooth where the hands go if the hands go to the same place every stroke for years, and the hands only go to the same place every stroke for years. If the tool fits the person using it, and the person using it knows what they are doing. She brought it home and put it on the shelf and did not tell anyone she had paid $2.50 for it, because that would have started a different conversation than the one she wanted, which was no conversation at all. People did talk, of course. They always do. The talking started in earnest around the time Ruth's 22nd year of accumulating coincided with the county's general awareness that she had turned 65 and not sold the property and not moved to a smaller place closer to the medical offices in town, which was what a reasonable person was understood to do. Dale Wickert, who ran the feed cooperative on Main and who had extended Ruth's late husband a line of credit for 12 years and who had always felt this entitled him to a certain familiarity with the Hadley family's choices, stopped by one spring afternoon when Ruth was in the dooryard carrying an armload of rusted equipment she had just purchased from the Fenner estate sale for $11.40 total. Dale stood by his truck and watched her carry the load toward the shed. She had a grain cradle head balanced over one arm and 3 hay hooks hanging from her fingers, and a bundle of old cast-iron cultivator wheels in a feed sack over her shoulder. He watched her without speaking for long enough that she had made 2 full trips before he said anything. He said he was sorry about her being alone out here. She set down the sack and looked at him. He said he knew she had always been particular about her things and her space, and he respected that, he said, but that it did seem to him and to others he had spoken to that some of this material might be doing more good at the county disposal, or perhaps at the metal recycler in Halverson if she was worried about the money, because it had to be, he said, a burden, all of this, on a fixed income, the upkeep of the shed and the property taxes and the acquisition of these things that nobody was, he said carefully, going to want. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Someone will want them." Dale smiled the way a man smiles when he has decided to be kind. He said that was a lovely thought. She picked up the feed sack and went back to the shed. The source of what she knew was not complicated, but it was specific. Her father's brother, the one who had built the iron shelves, had spent 30 years as an implement dealer, and the last 8 of those years traveling to agricultural colleges and living history farms and emerging museum programs across the northern Midwest, consulting on what tools these institutions should be acquiring and preserving before the farmsteads broke up and the equipment went to scrap. His name was Clarence, and he had kept a ledger for those 8 years, a physical ledger in a canvas-covered composition book, and when he died at 81, he left it to Ruth, along with the shed and the remnants of what he had been unable to preserve himself, which was still a considerable quantity of material. The ledger was organized by implement category, then by decade of manufacture, then by regional origin, and within each entry, Clarence had noted in his small, cramped hand the acquisition price he had paid or witnessed paid, the condition of the piece, and a figure he called the patient price, which was his estimate, based on 30 years of watching institutions and collectors try to reassemble what had been thrown away, of what each category of tool would eventually command when scarcity and scholarly interest combined to make them genuinely difficult to find. He had been, in his quiet way, a student of cycles. He had watched things be discarded and then mourned. He had watched people pay large sums for things they had previously given away. He had noted the pattern enough times to have lost his surprise at it, though not his melancholy. The ledger had one entry on its inside front cover that was not a data record. It was a single sentence in Clarence's hand, written in heavier ink than the rest, as though he had come back to it deliberately. It read, "Iron is patient because iron does not know it is waiting." Ruth had read that sentence when she was 43 and received the ledger. She had thought about it for several years before she understood that Clarence had not been describing iron. He had been describing the people who understood iron, the ones who were willing to wait without knowing how long the wait would be, without assurance that the patience would be rewarded in their own lifetime, keeping the material safe and cataloged and ready for a future they could not fully see. The patient price. She came back to those 2 words often. The secondary figures who arrived over the following years each brought their own flavor of certainty. There was Marcy Tolliver from the County Extension Office who came by in an official capacity to discuss property use classifications and who, while being genuinely helpful about the filing requirements, mentioned several times that storage of non-operational agricultural equipment could create certain perceptions and that Ruth might want to think about how the property read from the road, which was a kind way of saying that the shed looked like what Marcy privately called accumulation rather than what Ruth privately called a collection in progress. Ruth offered Marcy a glass of cold water, which Marcy accepted, and when Marcy left, she drove slowly past the shed and looked at it in a way that Ruth could see was not without judgment. There was Gerald Pruitt, who owned a furniture restoration business in the next county over, and who heard about Ruth's shed through a chain of second-hand acquaintance and drove out to offer to buy the shed's contents in bulk. He was not impolite about it. He offered a flat $500 for everything, which he framed as extremely generous given that most of the material was, in his estimation, non-functional and in categories with limited collector appeal. He had a spreadsheet on his phone. He turned it toward her and showed her columns. He had researched it, he said, and he said it with the quiet confidence of a man who has researched something and thereby closed the question. Ruth looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at Gerald. She said she would think about it. She said it the way people say things they have no intention of thinking about. There was also a period of about 3 years in Ruth's 54th through 57th years when a neighbor named Tom Breckenridge, who farmed 400 acres of corn and soybeans on the north end of the road with equipment financed at terms that Ruth gathered were aggressive, took to stopping at the fence line when she was working in the dooryard and calling over to ask how the museum was coming along. He said museum the way certain people say a word, with a slight inflation that makes it its own kind of dismissal. Ruth would look up from whatever she was holding and say, "Coming along fine, Tom," and go back to work. She never said more than that. She understood that argument would give the dismissal weight and that silence would eventually make it boring, which it did, and Tom Breckenridge eventually stopped calling over. The lone person who did not need the dismissal to become boring before she stopped was a woman named Vera Stoltz, who arrived in the late summer of Ruth's 58th year, driving a truck with a cracked windshield and a university parking permit hanging from the mirror. Vera was a material culture historian, which she explained in approximately 4 sentences before Ruth interrupted to ask if she wanted to see the grain cradles. Vera stopped talking and said yes. They went into the shed. Vera spent 3 hours in the shed on that first visit. She did not speak very much either, which Ruth took as a sign of seriousness. She examined implement heads and looked at the back stamps and foundry marks and held the balanced grain cradle for a long time without saying anything. When she finally spoke, she asked Ruth if she had a catalog of the holdings. Ruth showed her the ledger and her own extension of it, a second composition book she had begun filling in at the point where Clarence's entries ran out, using his same category structure and adding her own columns. Condition at acquisition, work done in restoration, current condition, estimated replacement cost if the piece were to be sourced today, and a column she had headed simply Rarity, which she scored on a scale she had developed by cross-referencing Clarence's observations with the acquisition records of 7 living history programs she had been corresponding with by letter and later by email for 11 years. Vera looked at the ledger and the extension catalog for a long time. She said, "You built a provenance record." Ruth said, "Clarence started it. I finished his and started mine." Vera looked up from the book. She said, "Do you understand what you have in here?" Ruth said, "I have some idea." Vera said, "Do you need help?" Ruth said, "I have been doing restoration on the worst pieces myself, but there are some heads and some of the mechanical implements I would not want to work on without someone who knew the chemistry better." Vera said, "I know the chemistry." Ruth said, "I know you do. I read your paper on the derusting protocols for pre-1900 Ferris tools." Vera did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That paper has 14 citations total." Ruth said, "I found it through the 3rd one." That was the whole conversation. The next Saturday, Vera arrived at 6 in the morning with a set of conservation supplies in a toolbox, and they worked until dark and spoke very little and ate sandwiches standing up at the workbench, and by the end of the day the understanding between them was complete without having been stated. What followed was 7 years of steady work. Ruth continued to acquire. She continued to pay a dime or a quarter or $2.50, depending on what was in front of her and how close to gone it was. Vera came on most weekends from September through May, and for 2 full weeks each August. They developed a shared notation system for the catalog and a shared protocol for the restoration work and a shared silence on the question of what it was all for, which was a silence that covered the fact that they both knew exactly what it was for, but that saying it aloud felt like a way of making it smaller. In the wider world, during those 7 years, several things happened that were noticed and celebrated and that had no apparent relation to a shed on Cutter's Road. The regional antique and agricultural heritage market underwent a significant expansion, driven partly by the closure of several large working farms and the dispersal of their equipment into estate sales, and partly by the establishment of 3 new agricultural heritage museums in the surrounding states, each of which was trying to assemble a teaching collection and finding that the well-documented, well-preserved material was increasingly scarce and expensive. Auction records for pre-1920 hand implements began to climb. A grain cradle with original fingers, original snath, and documented provenance sold at a Chicago specialty auction for $840. Then for $1,200. Then for $1,900. Ruth read these figures in the newsletters she subscribed to, and in the auction records Vera forwarded to her, and she noted them in a column at the back of the extension catalog. She did not tell anyone. She did not change what she was doing. She paid a dime for the rusted hooks when she found them, and she brought them home and cleaned them, and cataloged them, and shelved them in the ordered dark of the shed, and went inside and read Clarence's ledger the way other people read something they love, not for new information but for the texture of the knowing. The thing that broke the surface was not a drama. It was a letter. The letter arrived in the spring of what would have been Ruth's 69th year, from an acquisitions director at a heritage preservation trust that operated in partnership with 4 university extension programs across 3 states. The trust had been trying for 2 years to locate a sufficient collection of pre-1920 small grain hand implements in documented condition to serve as the core of a traveling educational exhibit. They had been told by a chain of referrals that ran through Vera and back through the living history programs Ruth had been corresponding with, and back further through a museum registrar who had purchased 12 items from Ruth 6 years earlier and remembered the quality of the documentation, that there was a collection on Cutter's Road that might be worth a conversation. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It was courteous and careful. It said the trust was aware that collectors often had complex feelings about their holdings and that no pressure was intended. It asked if Ruth would be willing to allow a site visit. Ruth wrote back a 1-paragraph letter. She said yes. They came in May, 3 of them, the acquisitions director, a conservator, and a registrar. They were professional and pleasant, and they walked into the shed, and they stopped. The conservator said, "Who did the restoration work on these heads?" Ruth said, "Mostly me, some of it with a colleague." The conservator picked up a hay fork head that Ruth had acquired in deplorable condition from a farm sale 12 years earlier and had spent 40 hours cleaning and stabilizing. She turned it in the light. She said, "What protocol did you use?" Ruth described the protocol. The conservator listened without speaking. When Ruth finished, the conservator said, "That is exactly what we would have done." The registrar had found the extension catalog by this point and was reading it at the workbench with the focused expression of someone who has been looking for a thing for a long time and has just found it. He looked up and asked about the provenance documentation on a particular category of binding hook. Ruth opened the catalog to the relevant section and showed him. He read it. He closed the catalog and opened it again at the beginning and started over from the first page. The acquisitions director was walking the shelves slowly. She stopped in front of the grain cradle. She did not touch it yet. She said, "May I?" Ruth said, "Yes." The director lifted it and held it at the correct angle, which told Ruth she had used one, or at least watched one used closely enough to know the posture. She turned it slowly. She set it back on the shelf. She said, "How long have you been building this?" Ruth said, 22 years on my own. 8 years before that in the record only." The director was quiet for a moment. She said, "We have been trying to assemble a collection like this for 11 years. Ruth said, "I know. I read your program's acquisition reports." The director looked at her. Ruth said, "You were paying too much for pieces in poor condition with thin provenance. I thought you would eventually correct toward documented material." The director said, "And here we are." Ruth said, "Here you are." What was negotiated over the following 3 months was not simple, and the documentation that governed it ran to 64 pages. But the terms in plain language were these. The trust would lease, not purchase, a core selection of 312 pieces from Ruth's collection for an initial period of 5 years, with options to renew and a first right clause if Ruth ever chose to sell. The lease payments were structured not as a lump sum but as an annual figure indexed to the exhibit attendance numbers, which meant that the more people the collection educated, the more Ruth received for having made the education possible. Vera was engaged as the traveling exhibit's primary conservator at a rate that reflected her 7 years of underpaid weekend work in the shed. Ruth retained full ownership of every piece, the catalog, the ledger, and the provenance documentation. The trust agreed to credit both Ruth and Clarence's original ledger work in all exhibit materials. The terms were Ruth's. She had written them in a 4-page letter before the first formal meeting, and the director had read them and made 3 small amendments and accepted the rest. Dale Wickert heard about it from his cousin, who heard about it from a woman in the extension office who had been copied on a county economic development announcement about the exhibit. He drove out to Cutter's Road on a Tuesday morning in late summer. Ruth was in the dooryard cataloging a new acquisition, a set of cast-iron cultivator wheels in exceptional original condition that she had purchased for 60 cents each from a woman in the next county who had been about to take them to the recycler. Dale stood by his truck. He said he had heard something about a deal with a museum trust. Ruth looked up and said yes. He said he was glad for her, and he seemed to be, in the thin way of a man who is glad that something he expected to be wrong has turned out less wrong than he feared, which is a different thing from being glad for the right reasons. He said he had always believed she knew what she was doing. Ruth looked at him for a moment. She said he was welcome to come inside and see the shed before the exhibit team came to crate the first shipment. He came inside. He stood in the middle of the shed and looked at the 3 walls of shelved implements, the ordered categories, the catalog hanging on its hook by the door, the restored grain cradle on its dedicated stand in the corner with its 5 black walnut fingers and its worn ash snath and its tag in Ruth and Vera's shared notation system. Dale stood there for a long time. He said, "I didn't know." Ruth said no. He said, "I should have." Ruth said, "It didn't matter." And it was true. It had not mattered. The knowing had been sufficient for the work, and the work had been sufficient for the purpose, and the purpose had been larger than his knowing or not knowing, and standing here in the shed on a Tuesday in late summer saying I should have known was a kind of pain that Dale had earned and that Ruth could not give back to him, and did not try to. She offered him a glass of water. He accepted it. They stood in the shed and did not say very much else. The traveling exhibit opened in October of that year at a land-grant university 3 states east and drew 4,000 visitors in its first 2 weeks, which was 3 times the trust's projection. The opening panel of the exhibit, facing the entrance so that it was the first thing every visitor read, was a reproduction of Clarence Hadley's ledger entry for the binding hook category, his small cramped hand photographed and enlarged to readability, and beside it a printed note explaining that the collection had been assembled and preserved by his niece over 30 years, using an acquisition and documentation system derived from his 8 years of fieldwork, and that the cost of the entire core collection had been less than $1,200 in acquisition fees across 2 decades, which was noted not to boast, but because the number was necessary for understanding what the word patient meant in practice. Below the ledger reproduction, there was a second panel. It carried a single sentence in large plain type. The sentence was the one Clarence had written in heavier ink on the inside front cover, the one Ruth had read at 43 and thought about for several years before she understood what he meant. It read, "Iron is patient because iron does not know it is waiting." Below that, in smaller type, the exhibit credited Ruth Hadley's extension of the ledger and noted that she was available by appointment at the property on Cutter's Road, where the remainder of the collection was housed and where she continued to acquire, to catalog, and to restore, paying a dime for the rusted hooks when she could find them for a dime, and more when she could not. The sentence was still there on the panel when the exhibit reached its 14th stop, 3 years later, at a university in the far northwest of the country, where a graduate student in material culture history read it, then read it again, then photographed it with her phone and stood in front of it for a while, and then walked through the rest of the exhibit very slowly, looking at each implement in turn, reading each tag in Ruth and Vera's shared notation, and by the time she reached the grain cradle with the 5 black walnut fingers and the worn ash snath, she had already taken out a notebook and started writing down questions she wanted to ask the woman on Cutter's Road. She wrote to Ruth that evening. Ruth wrote back 3 days later. The letter was one paragraph. It said the shed was open on most Saturday mornings, and that if the student knew the chemistry, there was work to do.